Coach Brandon here today, and today we're going to be talking about hydration for powerlifters, or Hydration 101. This is one of the most forgotten components of health and performance, especially for powerlifters and just athletes overall. Let's go ahead and get into it. So we have to understand that water, of course, is incredibly essential for our body. But the biggest issue that I have with standard water intake guidelines or parameters for athletes is they are incredibly generic, they take into account practically nothing, and they do not vary sport to sport. We'll get into that more here in just a second. So we're going to talk about hydration much further than just powerlifting. We'll talk about it in a few different sports and how it's actually altered as far as guidelines go or optimization goes. Now, the first really interesting stat I want to throw your way is that as little as 2% dehydration can cause as much as a 10% reduction in exercise capacity, okay, or work capacity rather. This is an incredibly staggering number because 2% dehydration is incredibly easy to enter. Individuals enter 2% dehydration as little as 20 minutes within the average practice, especially if we're talking about a sport like MMA, wrestling, or something of this nature where people are sweating profusely. 20 minutes into practice, a 2% dehydration status can happen like that. Powerlifting is not all too different. In powerlifting, we have some very large and not so in shape lifters, let's be honest, and they tend to sweat profusely just doing generic simple things. For example, if you ever catch me doing a dead bug, after about 3 reps per side, I am dripping. And that's within a few minutes of just my warm-up. That's one of 5-ish exercises I'm doing and my warm-up alone. So again, this status of dehydration can be entered very easily. So we have to understand that. And again, it can come with as much as a 10% reduction in overall work capacity, along with much further degradations in work capacity that we'll get into here in just a second. So the big solution that people typically have is just drink as much water as possible, right? Wrong. This could not be further from the truth. And the reason why is because of a term called hyponatremia. So what does hyponatremia means? Hypo means low and natremia means sodium. So exercise-induced hyponatremia is something that is incredibly common, but it of course varies quite a bit in severity. So we have to understand, it's kind of a scary thought here, but hyponatremia is actually something you can and people have actually died from, which is really scary. This happens a lot during big weight cuts. So for example, certain UFC fighters, this is a sport that's obviously highly publicized, certain UFC fighters have had to drop out of their fights the day before or 2 days before because of water poisoning, which is what they oftentimes refer to it as, but it's not really water poisoning necessarily. It's instead hyponatremia. It's a status where they drink tons and tons of pure water, but their electrolyte balance goes to shit. They do not have enough electrolytes, they do not have enough sodium. They just pound tons of water, as many athletes do, with the philosophy that more is better. But again, there is plenty of poor effects that comes with drinking too much water and not enough electrolytes, which brings me to my next point. What does hydration even mean? A lot of individuals think of hydration as just, are you drinking enough water? But this isn't the case. Hydration, what it means to be truly hydrated or optimally hydrated as an athlete, is having the right balance of water to electrolytes. Too much water and too little electrolytes has performance degradation. But on the reverse end of things, too little water, too much sodium, the same thing. So hydration isn't a one-size-fits-all kind of thing, and it's certainly not a just drink as much water as you can. Instead, it's a balance to be struck to optimize performance. Now, one example I like to give here is that back when I used to wrestle, way back in high school, I had one particular athlete who had a philosophy. He was a 105-pound wrestler, I believe, and he would drink 2 gallons of water per day. Now, we need to understand that 2 gallons is pretty damn extreme, but it's not necessarily off of what some people's water needs are. But for him, he didn't sweat a lot. He really didn't take in jack crap for electrolytes. He just drank tons of water. And what happened to him constantly were telltale signs of electrolyte imbalance, or just not getting enough electrolytes, not getting enough sodium in his diet. So he experienced a lot of degradation to performance because of this, because him and a lot of other individuals that are typically younger in age, youth athletes, have this philosophy that they just need to drink as much water as they can, and that's being hydrated. And again, we'll get into why that is consequential to performance here in just a minute. But the biggest issues with hydration for athletes actually stem from one-size-fits-all guidelines or recommendations to hydration practices. This is by far the biggest detriment to an athlete's ability to stay hydrated. They have a bunch of different one-size-fits-all standard recommendations in their head, one of the most common of which is drink half your body weight in ounces per day, and that's great for everybody, right? Wrong. We'll get into that in a little bit more in the next slide, but what we need to understand is hydration, or optimal hydration, is a fairly nuanced topic that has a lot of variables tied to it for many different individuals. We need to understand the factors that actually vary hydration needs, the dietary implications of water intake needs, environment very much matters, which we'll get into here in a bit, the effects of training fluid loss, and then lastly, how do we test somebody's hydration, because this is something that there is massive misunderstandings about, one part of which I am very passionate about and I'll talk to here in just a little bit. But going back to the issues with blanket statements, just drink half your body weight in ounces is something that I have literally seen in university classroom textbooks, which is incredibly disappointing. It makes absolutely no sense, and there's a variety of different problems with it. To name a few, it doesn't take into account physical activity or exercise. Half your body weight in ounces may be a decent recommendation for a very small population of individuals, but it can be a terrible recommendation the very next day because our water needs vary on a day-to-day basis. It's also not individualized by any means. Aspects such as body composition can greatly influence water intake needs. But once again, environment very much matters, and genetics even matter. And this is something that is a forgotten component of how hydration needs vary. So for example, you'll see a lot of individuals have an incredible difference person to person, athlete to athlete, in how salty of a sweater they are. This is actually very important to note. There's some athletes that have been tested or studied losing as much as 5 grams of salt in their sweat in an hour, while the same person who's sweating the exact same amount of pure fluid is only losing 1 gram of salt per hour. There's massive variety in how salty of a sweater somebody is, which is of course going to vary their hydration needs, which is why when we talk about what the best rehydration solution is during playing a sport, that's also something that needs to be very individualized. There's some individuals that are going to need a electrolyte or fluid solution that has far more salt, far more electrolytes, while there's some individuals that need far less and more so need water to rehydrate themselves. So there's a ton of variability within genetics as far as salty sweaters go as well, but to take it a step further, there's also individuals that just flat out, taking salt out of the equation for a second, there's some individuals that just flat out sweat like crazy. It doesn't even make sense. And some of them are actually in damn good shape too. I guarantee we all have that. At least one person in their friend group that we grew up around where a brisk walk and they'd be dripping sweat. Cold out, snow out, and they're still dripping sweat after a mere quarter-mile walk. It's really crazy the variability there as well, which again, very much affects hydration needs. To give one example though, in the terms of drink half your body weight in ounces, that's standard recommendations I've even seen in textbooks. To give one example or comparison, compare a 135-pound female powerlifter to a 220-pound male wrestler. Their hydration needs is going to be unbelievably different. Unbelievably different. You take the 135-pound female powerlifter, they're likely not going to sweat very much in their day-to-day training. Squat, bench, deadlift, there's certain exceptions to this, of course, but standard powerlifting training really doesn't exert a whole lot of sweat for the average athlete. Of course, there's exceptions to this left and right, and it depends on the kind of training they're doing throughout the year, but in an average training session for a powerlifter, the differential as far as sweat and hydration needs compared to the 220-pound wrestler is dramatic. It is unbelievably different. But with that being said, let's say we find a good number, a good water intake or good hydration practice for that 220-pound wrestler. We find a really good one. Let's say it's 1.5 gallons per day, a certain amount of electrolytes added into their solution they drink during training. Maybe they preload and postload with some kind of sodium or electrolyte solution, and we found a good answer for them. One day of the week, they'll go to a practice and they will literally sweat out 11 pounds of fluid. The next day is an off day. They don't train in any way, shape, or form. Do you think their hydration needs are going to be the same on those 2 days? The hell it is. It is not going to be remotely the same. So even when you find a good recommendation for a specific individual, still it's going to vary drastically on a day-to-day basis. Some wrestling practices are what we call gut check days, and it's because sometimes you see their guts, they're working so stinking hard for so long, while some wrestling practice days are quite easy. They're just easy drilling days. Some days he may just weight train. Some days he may not do any kind of training. So again, even going back to just the same example of the same wrestler, his hydration needs are going to vary incredibly. But based upon the current consensus of the advice or guidelines that are put out by many, many individuals, even high-level educational facilities such as the university education, just drinking half your body weight in ounces makes no damn sense. And it doesn't even make sense for one individual on different days. So we need to understand that as well. And even with myself, my hydration needs have had to vary drastically going sport to sport. So for example, in high school, I, along with many other individuals, played a lot of different sports. I did track for a while, I wrestled for a while, I played football for a while, and when I did track, I decided I did not want to run. I am tired of running, so what did I do? I threw a spear. Throwing spears sound cool. So I tried the javelin, and it was really fun, I got a lot out of it, but guess how much I sweat while I did it? Not at all, not even a little bit. But you compare that to wrestling season, and I'm practicing intensely twice a day, every day, with very intense wrestling practices, and even doing some weight training on top of that. So once again, hydration needs, same individual, different sporting seasons, drastically different. So we have to keep this in mind. I cannot emphasize enough the need for a tailored approach to hydration, not just individual to individual, but the same individual on different days or during different seasons. Now, there are some dietary implications, and I would say this is actually one of the most forgotten components of hydration. It's something that people just completely brush off as something that's more so arbitrary, but it is very important. Massive amounts of our daily water intake actually comes from food. Studies show this varies drastically from individual to individual, but on average, around 20 to 25%, again, on average, for some individuals, it's twice as much. For some individuals, it's half as much. But around 25% of our daily intake of fluid of water actually comes from food. What people don't always realize is most of our food is primarily made from water, primarily comprised of water. So eating an ultra-processed diet versus an unprocessed diet is going to very much vary our needs as far as water intake goes. So for example, what do we know about ultra-processed food? It has a lot of preservatives, usually come in the form of salt, has a lot of salt in it, and very little water. I'll give you some examples here in just a second, but on the reverse end of things, comparing an unprocessed diet to an ultra-processed diet, on the unprocessed diet side of things, we could talk about a lot of different factors, such as the satiating factors of an unprocessed diet, how it affects ghrelin, our PYY satiety hormone. There are many differences within these two different dietary components, but specifically relating to hydration, an unprocessed food is going to have lots of water, very little to no salt, very little to no actual salt, actual preservatives. So if you are somebody that has an ultra-processed diet compared to an unprocessed, or the same individual that is varying their diet throughout the year, your diet alone or dietary interventions made to it can very much change your needs as far as both water intake goes and salt and electrolyte intake goes. And this is very important to note. So to name a few examples of food, and again, to put it very simply, overly processed food, greater water intake needs. Unprocessed food or unprocessed diets, less water intake needs, but we likely need far more sodium, especially if you're an athlete. Very important to note there. But to name a few examples, as you can see, we have strawberries, we have tomatoes, we have cucumbers, and look at how much of its weight is comprised of water. For example, cucumber is 96.7% water. That is insane. The vast majority of it is going to be comprised of water. But I want you to compare that to something else on this list. Compare that to the biscuit. The biscuit is 3% water, which is a drastic difference. The other night, I had one of my favorite fast food restaurants, one of my guilty pleasure foods. I had Popeyes. I love Popeyes. I love their biscuits specifically. And by the way, if you're looking for hypertrophy, my goodness, are those calorically dense biscuits. Like 300 calories per biscuit. I can put down 3 or 4 like nothing. But anyways, point being that biscuit was comprised of 3% water. So if you take a meal you get from, say, Popeyes and compare it to, let's say, steak steak, potato, and some fruit on the side, that steak, potato, and fruit is going to be comprised of a shit ton of water and not so much electrolytes, not so much salt, unless of course you heavily salt it. While the Popeyes example, the biscuits and everything else that comes with a Popeyes meal, 3% water, but a ton of salt. And this very much changes your needs as an athlete to enter a status of optimal hydration, which again is the balance of water to electrolytes. So diet is extremely important. And to put it very bluntly, though I don't like characterizing any diet as crappy, bad, unhealthy, shitty, but what people typically know as a shittier diet, they require a lot greater water intake and less of an emphasis on salt intake because they're getting so much salt from their actual diet. Now, I want to talk a little bit about my personal experience with altering my diet. For me personally, I really take advantage of the difference within unprocessed versus processed foods in terms of their effects on hunger hormones and satiety hormones. What studies have shown is that ultra-processed foods actually have less of effect on satiety and less of effect on hunger. So basically, if you eat ultra-processed foods, as most people have known through experience, you'll typically get hungry sooner and you'll get a lot less satiated. So eating ultra-processed food, as studies show, is a really good tactic to actually gain more calories. If you're struggling to get into calorie surplus, which is needed to gain muscle optimally, incorporating a little bit more ultra-processed foods is a very effective way to make sure you get into a consistent, meaningful caloric surplus. But for me personally, I go through phases throughout the year where I'm focusing on fat loss, phases where I'm focusing on muscle gain, just like most athletes do. With that being said, during the muscle gain phase, I have quite a bit of ultra-processed food. During the fat loss phase, I pretty much drop nearly all ultra-processed food. And what I noticed, without knowing much about this hydration status information, what I noticed was every single time I was trying to gain weight, I felt incredibly dehydrated. I couldn't believe how dehydrated I felt. None of my practices changed as far as daily water and sodium intake as far as fluids go. But by changing my diet alone without knowing a lot of this information, I noticed I was in a constant status of dehydration. And I never really knew why until I started studying this. The simple reason why is exactly what we just covered. When I was eating ultra-processed foods, that 25% of water or fluid I was getting from my food dropped drastically. But then again, when I went back to a fat loss phase, what happened was I'd incorporate a lot of unprocessed foods. That way I'd feel more satiated after eating, and my hunger hormones would be benefited in an optimal way for controlling calorie intake and consistently remaining in a caloric deficit. And during that time, I had all the telltale signs of not intaking enough electrolytes. We'll get into here in a sec what those side effects are, but just to kind of briefly touch on it now, I felt dizzy. I had consistent headaches. I had a lot of brain fog and cognitive issues, especially after training or during training. And the simple reason why was because I, on an unprocessed diet, just wasn't getting the amount of salt or electrolytes I was normally getting. So I had to alter my diet to optimize it to salt my foods more heavily or just to get more salt in my day-to-day life. Someone that talks about this quite often, as kind of popularized the topic, is Stan Efferding. If you want to learn more about that, he has some good information on it. But this is something that's very important to note. Foods very much vary our needs to enter optimal hydration. Now, going back on this again, salt isn't evil. There is an unbelievable amount of misunderstandings as far as what salt does for our body. It is a vital aspect of our body's day-to-day tasks, our body's day-to-day function, but furthermore, it's even more vital for athletes. Salt does a lot of very needed things within our body. And while there are a small percentage of individuals that are, say, in a hypertensive, there are a small percentage of individuals that do need to limit salt intake. Small population of individuals that do. But the vast majority, I would say just about every single one of the athletes that I've ever worked with, they always suffer from not getting enough in, which brings about the point of not using stand-across dietary interventions or dietary advice for individuals that are hypertensive and maybe in an obesogenic state, and not using the same advice for them as you would for an athlete, because their dietary needs are going to change, of course, very much, but as well as their salt needs, as well as their electrolyte needs. So more often than not, athletes actually don't get enough salt from their actual day-to-day lives, and because because of that, they experience a lot of performance negative effects. So to name a few side effects that are typically associated with not getting enough salt through our diet or not getting enough electrolytes throughout the day is going to be headaches, stomach pain, dizziness, body aches, cognitive function issues, that's a really big one, and nausea. For example, with me personally, back when I changed to an unprocessed diet and didn't really understand this stuff all too well, I started experiencing all of these in surplus, especially the second I got done with training. I always noticed the second I got done with training, I'd always tell people, sorry man, my brain's not working right now. It's just not working. It's on a hiatus. I don't know why. It's just not working. And I always noticed that quite heavily after training, just about every single session. And upon actually supplementing with certain sodium tablets and electrolyte solutions, what I've actually started to do is preload and postload with electrolyte solutions. And since doing that, I no longer have those effects. But furthermore, my performance in training, and especially my work capacity during training, has optimized to a tremendous degree. And this is something that I do to this day quite heavily to make sure I am optimally hydrated, because once again, optimal hydration is the balance, not just the water. Now, also, actually, to go back on that slide once more, these tiny writing down here cites a study that was a really well done recent study. And from my understanding, it's actually the biggest sodium study ever done. Very, very well done, the PURE study. And there's a number of different recent studies, and the research consensus is more and more pointing towards the fact that all these years we've spent considering salt as evil is actually really far from the truth. Again, small percentage of people that need to look out for it. There's some genetic factors in mind there. There's some factors as far as body composition goes. It changes whether or not you need to worry about getting too much in. But the fact of the matter is that this salt is evil philosophy that the world has had for so long is actually turning out to be less and less true as more well-done studies, specifically studies like the PURE study, come out and is bringing to light the fact that electrolyte salt is actually an ergogenic supplement almost for athletes that can really benefit performance, because so many of them are actually lacking it. Now, testing for hydration. This is a really important one. And the most common and infuriating misunderstanding about hydration is something I'm about to touch on here in just a second. But testing for hydration, again, is crucial to optimize hydration. You never really know until you test it. And there's a myriad of different ways that we can actually test hydration. Now, note that all testing should be done in the morning at a consistent time, especially if you're testing multiple times. But there's lab measurements. There's lab measurements that are, of course, the most accurate, such as the urine-specific gravity, the osmocheck, and the in-body analysis scale. Now, some of these are really stinking expensive, while some of them really aren't that bad. For example, the in-body analysis, though it's on the lower end as far as accuracy goes, the in-body analysis actually can populate some pretty good metrics as far as what your hydration status is. And a lot of individuals have in-body analysis scales at home, and many gyms have more advanced in-body analysis scales that they let members use on a day-to-day basis. So you can assess your current hydration with items like this, but they're, again, more so considered lab measurements. I would argue that if you're a serious athlete, it would be more than worth it to get an item like this to test consistently and make sure you're optimizing this very important component as much as possible. But if you're somebody that doesn't have a urine-specific gravity, doesn't have the money to buy all this specific lab measurements, I definitely don't blame you. There's other ways we can assess it. They're a little less accurate, but they work for the time being, and that is a two-part system of first asking yourself a subjective scale of how thirsty you are, 1 to 10, and then the second and more important one is actually assessing urine color. But here's where I talk about the biggest misconception. The biggest misconception by far is doing your business, urinating, looking at the bowl, and seeing what the color is, which is what I would say 98% of people do, but it couldn't be further from an optimal practice. The reason why is because, let's go ahead and tie this to an analogy. If you were trying to decide upon the perfect color, you're looking at the smallest differences between a color like white. Is it eggshell white? Is it ghost white? As you can tell, I don't know the different differences within whites, but if you think about the smallest little differences within colors that you're deciding for your home, you want to make it perfect, what would happen? While assessing these colors, while finding, let's say, the perfect white, and you're deciding between a dozen different variations of white, each and every one that you are looking at and assessing, you toss a gallon of it into multiple gallons of water and assess it while it's in water. Would that make sense? Do you think you can get an accurate measurement of what color you should choose for your ideal home painting or home color? No, that'd make no damn sense. You'd look at it in its purest form. You'd look at it while on those little color sticks, or you look at it while it's in the actual bucket. You definitely wouldn't toss it into water, dilute it a bunch, and then assess the differences in color from there. That make no damn sense. So why do we do that for urine? Why do we do that when assessing our urine color to test hydration? Everybody looks at the bowl. Everybody looks at the color of their urine and assesses hydration status once they urinate into a bowl of 1 to 2 to 3, there's probably a lot of variability here, but gallons of water. It dilutes it to an incredible degree and throws off any semblance of accuracy as far as assessing your urine color and determining whether you're hydrated or not. So what you should be doing is looking at the stream, not the bowl. And one of the things that I actually had a specific experience that made me realize this for the first time when I was, I think, 16, 15, probably 15. I was 15 years old, getting my first job, Subway, sandwich artist, really pretentious way to say guy that makes sandwiches. But I was at Subway and I had to get drug tested like many people do. So I went to the drug testing facility. I peed in a cup just like most individuals do. And as I did so, and I was handing it to the individual that was testing it, I looked at it and I thought, that is dark as hell. What is going on here? Like, it was so out of the ordinary dark, it made no sense to me. It clearly showed I was in a status of large amounts of, in a status of dehydration. Very, very large amount of dehydration at that too. And I started thinking about it further and finally realized it's because I was able to assess the stream. I was able to assess the true color of my urine by it coming in a cup and not diluting it in gallons of water. So that's when I first started noticing that there's a big difference there in assessing hydration through urine, which is a prominent way to do so when you dilute it in a bowl. So for individuals out there that want to use these tactics to actually assess hydration, it's a great way to do so, don't get me wrong, but check out the stream, do it in a cup and look at that. Do something of that nature. Looking at the bowl is a very big and common mistake that people make that really doesn't give you a remotely accurate measurement. Not all sports bring about the same risk. This is also very important to note. A lot of individuals make stand across recommendations on hydration based upon if you're an athlete or not. But athlete needs vary quite a bit, just like I've already touched on. But if you compare a baseball player to a wrestler, to a bowler, to a myriad of other sports, again, it's going to be very different. But also for the baseball player, one of the biggest things that changes is weather. So environment changes hydration needs to a ridiculous extent as well. So the rate at which we sweat while performing a sport is dependent upon a lot of different variables. To name a few, body size is a really big one, exercise intensity, exercise duration, pre-hydration status, and lastly, heat/humidity. So for example, within the sport of soccer, obviously there's a lot of running involved, but with a soccer player, the amount or the tactics they use for hydration needs to vary depending upon the weather they're playing in, and even the conditions likely that they're playing in as well. So for example, there's going to be some days in the middle of a game, it may be over 100 degrees out, while there's other games, they may be getting rained on, it's freezing, they're putting on sweatshirts while they're out for a few seconds of actual gameplay. And again, these present incredibly different hydration needs. So understand, the big thing you need to understand here is that sports, not all sports present the same risk by any means, but even the same sport in different kinds of conditions as far as environment and weather goes varies drastically. Now, unfortunately, most athletes, and this is a really interesting stat that was found through a few really well done studies, most athletes will only drink back about 50% of the fluid that they lose. This is drastic. This is really important to note. Going back to a more extreme example, the example I grew up in, wrestling, MMA, grappling, things of that nature, again, it's not uncommon for them to lose 10 to 15 pounds in a 2-hour practice of fluid loss, of sweat. If they drank 50% back and you're a 200-pound athlete, let's say you lose 10 pounds of fluid, which again, not remotely uncommon. You drink 50% back, 5 pounds back, you're still 5 pounds less than you normally are. You are at about a 2.5-ish% dehydration. And that's, again, that can vary drastically due to a number of different variables. But going back to the earlier stat and a few other stats we'll get into here in just a second, 2% dehydration equals what? Up to a 10% reduction in work capacity, along with many other downsides, many other effects that are not so favorable for competition. So considering the fact that most athletes will only drink back about 50%, this is far from ideal. Far, far from ideal. You cannot get in quality reps. You cannot get in quality practice. Your motor patterns will degrade. Your performance will degrade. Injury likelihood will increase if you enter a status of severe dehydration. And considering we only drink back about 50% of what we lose on average, this is concerning. This is going to happen on a day-to-day, practice-to-practice frequency. And wrestling, MMA examples, again, probably some of the worst ones, but even soccer, playing outdoors, 100-degree weather, they can get very bad as well. So drink when you're thirsty, right? This is a piece of advice I've actually seen popularized quite a bit on social media as of late. Very, very popular to say. There's some individuals, some doctors that are telling individuals things to the extent of just drink when you're thirsty. And again, this goes back to the fact that we have to tailor recommendations with nutrition, with a myriad of different things. Because the fact of the matter is, if you're using advice you would use for an obesogenic, hypertensive individual, the same advice you'd give to an athlete, that is ridiculous. They have completely different needs. Salt being a really good example of that. But drink when you're thirsty can be a decent guideline for an individual that does absolutely no activities. But if you're an active individual or an athlete, it's a god-awful recommendation that makes absolutely no sense. No sense whatsoever. If you really want to guarantee you're going to have far from optimal hydration, drink when you're thirsty. Really good advice if you don't want optimal hydration. This is especially concerning when it's cold out. And this is something that we also want to make sure we touch on because the weather can affect you in some severe ways. I've already touched on how heat can bring about more sweat, change hydration needs, needing to drink more. But furthermore, when it comes to being cold out, if any individual has ever done something active in the cold, you just don't get as thirsty. You really don't get as thirsty. So the weather can kind of play tricks on you. When it's really cold out, you may need a lot of water. You may be in a status of dehydration, but you don't really feel as thirsty. So that's another example of something that can severely affect you. So if you went with the advice, drink when you're thirsty, and you're playing out in the cold, again, terrible advice. Doesn't make any sense, nonsensical. And athletes enter a status of dehydration quite easily in competition, practice, or just general training. And some of the factors that very much influence how much water they voluntarily drink is temperature of said fluid, let's say, the temperature, the flavor, the amount of salt, and the visibility. They very much factor how much someone will drink voluntarily, which is why I'm a really big subscriber to the idea that if I'm a coach of a team, doesn't matter if it's baseball, wrestling, basketball, doesn't matter what we're talking about here, we should have a hydration solution clearly visible in a section of the court, section of the area of gameplay that all players have to pass consistently, they can see very easily. And we need to make sure that the temperature is optimal, because I'm not sure if anybody has ever, while under severely intense exercise conditions, if anybody has tried to rehydrate with warm water, it doesn't go well. It doesn't go well at all. Your ability to voluntarily drink enough to actually replenish what you're losing goes to shit. Okay, so actually having water that's a little bit on the colder side, though there's a little bit of a debate to this, having water on the colder side will make individuals want to voluntarily drink more. It's easier to drink typically in these conditions. Flavor, of course, very much water matters as well. But again, amount of salt, we have to vary that athlete to athlete to truly achieve optimization. But there needs to be some semblance at the very least of electrolytes within the fluid they are actually taking in during playing the sport. Because guess what? They're losing, yes, water, but they're also losing salt, they're losing electrolytes as well. And again, that varies genetically quite a bit, but having some of it at least is something that all athletes stand across the board will need. Now, the effects of water weight loss is incredibly severe. So even being slightly dehydrated actually also increases your perception of difficulty and pain. So this is something that doesn't get talked about a lot. Even being slightly dehydrated makes it so that things feel harder. Things feel quite a bit harder, which people don't always take into account as well. So for a 200-pound individual, for example, 2 pounds of fluid loss leads to impaired thermoregulation, significant decrease in work capacity, and a loss in appetite amongst many other things. 4-pound fluid loss leads to a 20 to 30% decrease in work capacity, and a 6-pound leads to severe impairment of exercise temperature regulation, which can get very dangerous, by the way, increased respiratory rate, and even numbness and tingling in the extremities. And keep in mind, this is by no means rare. This is by no means hard to achieve. This can happen quite easily. More examples of some stats that are pretty scary here for athletes out there. Again, 4% dehydration, 20 to 30% loss in work capacity. That is very severe, very, very severe. 6%, we're talking about the tingling in the extremities, all that stuff. 7% will likely lead to collapsing, especially if continue to exercise. And we have to understand that there's a lot of old paradigms within sports as far as coaching goes. And this is something that I get very, very frustrated about, especially coming from a wrestling background. There's a lot of coaches that have a harder is better mentality. I'll never forget one of the last coaches I had, not saying any names here, his philosophy was if he could train you for 3 hours straight as hard as physically possible, having gut check practices, and you didn't drink any water the entire time, that'll make it tougher, that'll make it better. But what happened? Athletes got injured left and right. Athletes could not perform in their schoolwork for the rest of the day. They couldn't rehydrate in time for the next session. They were having issue after issue after issue that all came from the fact that they were severely dehydrated constantly because they didn't even have the opportunity to do so because of these ridiculous practices that make no sense. I cannot say that enough. Make no sense of making athletes go an entire practice without drinking a sip of water to make them tougher, to make them a whole lot tougher, right? Well, when you have an athlete that sprains their ankle, tears a hamstring, does something severe that impacts the rest of their season, they may be a little bit tougher. That may be accomplished with your practice that make no fucking sense, but that's kind of going to hurt the rest of their season. This is incredibly common, and if I had my way, I would have these these coaches out of coaching because it really does terrible things for the athletes. Now, last slide we have here, strategies to optimize hydration. To name just 3 things that we should be focusing on practice-to-practice basis, start your training in euhydration. Start your training in a balanced state of hydration. Make sure we're getting enough electrolytes, make sure we're getting enough water, and be sure to start with optimal hydration. Avoid dehydration during training. Do not fall within the category or the stat of individuals drinking on average 50% of what they lose. Try to drink back 100% or as close as we can to it, and make sure that we are actually including electrolytes as well to not enter a status of hyponatremia or have anything along those lines happen, which again has degradation to performance in itself. 3, completely replenish lost fluids from exercise before the next session. There's many athletes out there that train 2, sometimes even 3 times a day, and one of the biggest issues that they have is that they're not replenishing their fluids, replenishing their status of optimal hydration before the next session, which degrades the efficiency of the next session, the performance of the next session to a significant degree. During practice, make sure fluids are readily available and in clear sight. The flavor and temperature of fluids are optimal for drinking plenty. Said fluids are not just water. And once again, I am a big believer in actually tailoring how much electrolytes is in a solution, individual to individual, depending upon how salty of a sweater they are. There's many tests to actually determine this, but once you have some semblance of an idea of how salty of a sweater you are, you can vary how many electrolytes are in your replenishment drink to make sure you're achieving optimal hydration throughout this session and not degrading performance by the end of it. And 4, consider individualized training tactics. Salty sweaters, the exact thing I just mentioned. Test your hydration. Really important one there. This is something I'm a really big believer in. Find a way to test it at least fairly consistently. If you're a coach, don't be a dumbass. Okay, don't be the guy that I just talked about. All right, you're not going to make your athletes tougher. You're sure as hell not going to make them better by making them go a whole practice without water. It makes absolutely no sense. You are doing very dumb things if you do that. Get out of coaching if you think that's a good idea. Could not be more serious about that. Optimal hydration requires a tailored approach. It's far from one size fits all. So keep all of this in mind. There are some more nuanced components to hydration, talking about individual electrolytes, talking about potassium, especially magnesium, things of this nature, but this is more of a 101 presentation that presents some really important things here that are not commonly understood in the industry of training, coaching, and other things of that nature.